Section 7 of Nonsense Novels. Nonsense Novels by Stephen Leacock. Section 7. Hannah of the Highlands; or, the Laird of Loch Aucherlocherty. Sair maun ye greet, but hoot awa', There's muckle yet, love isna a'; Nae more ye'll see, howe'er ye whine, The bonny breeks of Auld Lang Syne. The simple words rang out fresh and sweet upon the morning air. It was Hannah of the Highlands. She was gathering lobsters in the burn that ran through the glen. The scene about her was typically Highland. Wild hills rose on both sides of the burn, to a height of 75 feet, covered with a dense Highland forest that stretched 100 yards in either direction. At the foot of the burn a beautiful Scotch loch lay in the hollow of the hills. Beyond it again, through the gap of the hills, was the sea. Through the glen, and close beside the burn where Hannah stood, wound the road that rose again to follow the cliffs along the shore. The tourists in the Highlands will find no more beautiful spot than the glen of Aucherlocherty. Nor is there any spot which can more justly claim to be historic ground. It was here in the glen that bonny Prince Charlie had lain and hidden after the defeat of Culloden. Almost in the same spot the great boulder still stands behind which the Bruce had laid hidden after Bannockburn, while behind a number of lesser stones the Covenanters had concealed themselves during the height of the Stuart persecution. Through the glen Montrose had passed on his fatal ride to Killiecrankie, while at the lower end of it the rock was still pointed out, behind which William Wallace had paused to change his breeches, while flying from the wrath of Rob Roy. Grim memories such as these gave character to the spot. Indeed, most of the great events of Scotch history had taken place in the glen, while the little loch had been the scene of some of the most stirring naval combats in the history of the Grampian Hills. But there was little in the scene which lay so peaceful on this April morning to recall the sanguinary history of the glen. Its sides at present were covered with a thick growth of gorse, elderberry, eggplants, and gillyflower, while the woods about it were loud with the voice of the throstle, the linnet, the magpie, the jackdaw, and other songbirds of the Highlands. It was a gloriously beautiful Scotch morning. The rain fell softly and quietly, bringing dampness and moisture, and almost a sense of wetness to the soft moss underfoot. Gray mists flew hither and thither, carrying with them an invigorating rawness that had almost a feeling of dampness. It is the memory of such a morning that draws a tear from the eye of Scotchmen after years of exile. The Scotch heart, reader, can be moved to its depths by the sight of a raindrop or the sound of a wet rag. And meantime Hannah, the beautiful Highland girl, was singing. The fresh young voice rose high above the rain. Even the birds seemed to pause to listen, and as they listened to the simple words of the Gaelic folk song, fell off the bough with a thud on the grass. The Highland girl made a beautiful picture as she stood. Her bare feet were in the burn, the rippling water of which laved her ankles. The lobsters played about her feet, or clung affectionately to her toes, as if loath to leave the water and be gathered in the folds of her blue apron. It was a scene to charm the heart of a Burne Jones, or an Alma Tadema, or of anybody fond of lobsters. The girl's golden hair flowed widely behind her, gathered in a single braid with a piece of stovepipe wire. "Will you sell me one of your lobsters?" Hannah looked up. There, standing in the burn a few yards above her, was the vision of a young man. The beautiful Highland girl gazed at him fascinated. He seemed a higher order of being. He carried a fishing rod and basket in his hand. He was dressed in a salmon fishing costume of an English gentleman. Salmon fishing boots reached to his thighs, while above them he wore a fishing jacket fastened loosely with a fishing belt about his waist. He wore a small fishing cap on his head. There were no fish in his basket. He drew near to the Highland girl. Hannah knew as she looked at him that it must be Ian McWhinus, the new Laird. At sight she loved him. "You're sair welcome," she said, as she handed to the young man the finest of her lobsters. He put it in his basket. Then he felt in the pocket of his jacket and brought out a sixpenny piece. "You must let me pay for it," he said. Hannah took the sixpence and held it a moment, flushing with true Highland pride. "I'll no be selling the fush for money," she said. Something in the girl's speech went straight to the young man's heart. He handed her half a crown. Whistling lightly, he strode off up the side of the burn. Hannah stood gazing after him spellbound. She was aroused from her reverie by an angry voice calling her name. "Hannah! Hannah!" cried the voice. "Come away, Ben. Are ye daft, lass, that ye stand there keeking at a McWhinus?" Then Hannah realized what she had done. She had spoken with a McWhinus, a thing that no McShamus had done for 150 years. For nearly 2 centuries the McShamuses and the McWhinuses, albeit both dwellers in the Glen, had been torn asunder by one of those painful divisions by which the life of the Scotch people is broken into fragments. It had arisen out of a point of spiritual belief. It had been 6 generations agone at a Highland banquet, in the days when the unrestrained temper of the time gave way to wild orgies, during which theological discussions raged with unrestrained fury. Shamus McShamus, an embittered Calvinist, half crazed perhaps with liquor, had maintained that damnation could be achieved only by faith. Whymper McWhinus had held that damnation could be achieved also by good works. Inflamed with drink, McShamus had struck McWhinus across the temple with an oatcake and killed him. McShamus had been brought to trial. Although defended by some of the most skilled lawyers of Aucherlocherty, he had been acquitted. On the very night of his acquittal, Whangus McWhinus, the son of the murdered man, had lain in wait for Shamus McShamus in the hollow of the Glen road where it rises to the cliff, and had shot him through the bagpipes. Since then the feud had raged with unquenched bitterness for a century and a half. With each generation the difference between the two families became more acute. They differed on every possible point. They wore different tartans, sat under different ministers, drank different brands of whiskey, and upheld different doctrines in regard to eternal punishment. To add to the feud, the McWhinuses had grown rich, while the McShamuses had become poor. At least once in every generation a McWhinus or a McShamus had been shot, and always at the turn of the Glen road where it rose to the edge of the cliff. Finally, 2 generations gone, the McWhinuses had been raised to sudden wealth by the discovery of a coal mine on their land. To show their contempt for the McShamuses, they had left the Glen to live in America. The McShamuses, to show their contempt for the McWhinuses, had remained in the Glen. The feud was kept alive in their memory. And now the descendant of the McWhinuses had come back, and bought out the property of the Laird of Aucherlocherty beside the Glen. Ian McWhinus knew nothing of the feud. Reared in another atmosphere, the traditions of Scotland had no meaning for him. He had entirely degenerated. To him the tartan had become only a piece of colored cloth. He wore a kilt as a masquerade costume for a Halloween dance, and when it rained he put on a raincoat. He was no longer Scotch. More than that, he had married a beautiful American wife, a talcum powder blonde with a dough face and the exquisite rotundity of the packing house district of the Middle West. Ian McWhinus was her slave. For her sake he had bought the lobster from Hannah. For her sake, too, he had scrutinized closely the beautiful Highland girl, for his wife was anxious to bring back a Scotch housemaid with her to Chicago. And meantime Hannah, with the rapture of a new love in her heart, followed her father, Oyster McShamus, to the cottage. Oyster McOyster, even in advancing age, was a fine specimen of Scotch manhood. 97 years of age, he was approaching the time when many of his countrymen began to show the ravages of time. but he bore himself straight as a lath, while his tall stature and his native Highland costume accentuated the fine outline of his form. The costume consisted of a black velvet beetle shell jacket, which extended from the shoulder halfway down the back, and was continued in a short kilt of the tartan of the McShamuses, which extended from the waist halfway to the thigh. The costume reappeared again after an interval in the form of rolled golf stockings, which extended halfway up to the knee, while on his feet a pair of half shoes were buckled halfway up with the Highland clasp. On his head, halfway between the ear and the upper superficies of the skull, he wore half a Scotch cap, from which a tall rhinoceros feather extended halfway into the air. A pair of bagpipes were beneath his arm, from which, as he walked, he blew those deep and plaintive sounds which have done much to imprint upon the characters of those who hear them a melancholy and resigned despair. At the door of the cottage he turned and faced his daughter. "What said Ian McWhinus to you in the burnside?" he said fiercely. "'Twas nae muckle," said Hannah, and she added, for the truth was ever more to her than her father's wrath, "he gied me a saxpence for a fush." "Siller!" shrieked the Highlander. "Siller from a McWhinus!" Hannah handed him the sixpence. Oyster McOyster dashed it fiercely on the ground, then picking it up, he dashed it with full force against the wall of the cottage. Then, seizing it again, he dashed it angrily into the pocket of his kilt. They entered the cottage. Hannah had never seen her father's face so dour as it looked that night. Their home seemed changed. Hannah and her mother and father sat down that night in silence to their simple meal of oatmeal porridge and Scotch whisky. In the evening the mother sat to her spinning. Busily she plied her work, for it was a task of love. Her eldest born, Jamie, was away at college at Edinburgh, preparing for the ministry. His graduation day was approaching, and Jamie's mother was spinning him a pair of breeches against the day. The breeches were to be a surprise. Already they were shaping that way. Oyster McShamus sat reading the Old Testament in silence, while Hannah looked into the peat fire and thought of the beautiful young Laird. Only once the Highlander spoke. "The McWhinus is back," he said, and his glance turned towards the old flintlock musket on the wall. That night Hannah dreamed of the feud, of the glen and the burn, of love, of lobsters, and of the Laird of Loch Aucherlocherty, and when she rose in the morning there was a wistful look in her eyes, and there came no song from her throat. The days passed. Each day the beautiful Highland girl saw the young Laird, though her father knew it not. In the mornings she would see him as he came fishing to the burn. At times he wore his fishing suit, at other times he had on a knickerbocker suit of shepherd's plaid with a domino pattern negligee shirt. For his sake the beautiful Highland girl made herself more beautiful still. Each morning she would twine a Scotch thistle in her hair, and pin a spray of burdock at her heart. And at times he spoke to her. How Hannah treasured his words! Once, catching sight of her father in the distance, he had asked her who was the old sardine in the petticoats, and the girl had answered gladly that it was her father, for, as a fisherman's daughter, she was proud to have her father mistaken for a sardine. At another time he had asked her if she was handy about the work of the house. How Hannah's heart had beat at the question! She made up her mind to spin him a pair of breeches like the ones now finishing for her brother Jamie. And every evening as the sun set, Hannah would watch in secret from the window of the cottage, waiting for the young Laird to come past in his motor car, down the glen road to the sea. Always he would slacken the car at the sharp turn at the top of the cliff. For 6 generations no McWhinus had passed that spot after nightfall with his life. But Ian McWhinus knew nothing of the feud. At times Oyster McOyster would see him pass, and standing at the roadside would call down Gaelic curses on his head. Once, when her father was from home, Hannah had stood on the roadside, and Ian had stopped the machine and had taken her with him in the car for a ride. Hannah, her heart beating with delight, had listened to him as he explained how the car was worked. Had her father known that she had sat thus beside a McWhinus, he would have slain her where she sat. The tragedy of Hannah's love ran swiftly to its close. Each day she met the young Laird at the burn. Each day she gave him the finest of her lobsters; she wore a new thistle every day. And every night, in secret as her mother slept, she span a new concentric section of his breeches. And the young Laird, when he went home, said to the talcum blonde, that the Highland fisher girl was not half such a damn fool as she seemed. Then came the fateful afternoon. He stood beside her at the burn. "Hannah," he said, as he bent towards her, "I want to take you to America." Hannah had fallen fainting in his arms. Ian propped her against a tree and went home. An hour later, when Hannah entered her home, her father was standing behind the fireplace. He was staring fixedly into the fire, with the flintlock musket in his hands. There was the old dour look of the feud upon his face, and there were muttered curses on his lips. His wife Ellen clung to his arm and vainly sought to quiet him. "Curse him," he muttered. "I'll e'en kill him the night he passes in his deil machine." Then Hannah knew that Oyster McShamus had seen her with Ian beside the burn. She turned and fled from the house. Straight up the road she ran across towards the manor house of Aucherlocherty to warn Ian. To save him from her father's wrath, that was her one thought. Night gathered about the Highland girl as she ran. The rain clouds and the gathering storm hung low with fitful lightning overhead. She still ran on. About her was the rolling of the thunder and the angry roaring of the swollen burn. Then the storm broke upon the darkness with all the fury of the Highland gale. The sky was rent with the fierce play of the elements. Yet on Hannah ran. Again and again the lightning hit her, but she ran on still. She fell over the stones, tripped and stumbled in the ruts, butted into the hedges, cannoned off against the stone walls; but she never stopped. She went quicker and quicker. The storm was awful. Lightning, fire, flame and thunder were all about her. Trees were falling, hurdles were flying, birds were being struck by lightning. Dogs, sheep and even cattle were hurled through the air. She reached the manor house and stood a moment at the door. The storm had lulled, the rain ceased, and for a brief moment there was quiet. The light was streaming from the windows of the house. Hannah paused. Suddenly her heart misgave her. Her quick ear had caught the sound of a woman's voice within. She approached the window and looked in. Then, as if rooted to the spot, the Highland girl gazed and listened at the pane. Ian lay upon a sofa. The negligee dressing gown that he wore enhanced the pallid beauty of his face. Beside him sat the talcum powder blonde. She was feeding him with chocolates. Hannah understood. Ian had trifled with her love. He had bought her lobsters to win her heart, only to cast it aside. Hannah turned from the window. She plucked the thistle from her throat and flung it on the ground. Then, as she turned her eye, she caught sight of the motor standing in the shed. "The deil machine," she muttered, while the wild light of Highland frenzy gathered in her eye. Then, as she rushed to it and tore the tarpaulin from off it, "Ye'll no be wanting of a mark the night, Oyster McShamus," she cried. A moment later, the motor, with Hannah at the wheel, was thundering down the road to the glen. The power was on to the full, and the demented girl clung tight to the steering gear as the machine rocked and thundered down the descent. The storm was raging again, and the thunder mingled with the roar of the machine as it coursed madly towards the sea. The great eye of the motor blazed in front. The lurid light of it flashed a second on the trees and the burn as it passed, and flashed blinding on the eyes of Oyster as he stood erect on the cliff-side below, musket in hand, and faced the blazing apparition that charged upon him with the old Highland blood surging in his veins. It was all over in a moment. A blinding flash of lightning, the report of a musket, a great peal of thunder, and the motor bearing the devoted girl hurled headlong over the cliff. They found her there in the morning. She lay on her side motionless, half buried in the sand, upturned towards the blue Highland sky, serene now after the passing of the storm. Quiet and still she lay. The sea birds seemed to pause in their flight to look down on her. The little group of Scotch people that had gathered stood and gazed at her with reverential awe. They made no attempt to put her together. It would have been useless. Her gasoline tubes were twisted and bent, her tank burst, her sprockets broken from their sides, and her steering gear in utter wreck. The motor would never run again. After a time they roused themselves from their grief, and looked about for Hannah. They found her. She lay among the sand and seaweed, her fair hair soaked in gasoline. Then they looked about for Oyster McShamus. Him, too, they found, lying half buried in the grass and soaked in whiskey. Then they looked about for Ellen. They found her lying across the door of the cottage, half buried in Jamie's breeches. Then they gathered them up. Life was not extinct. They chafed their hands. They rubbed their feet. They put hot bricks upon their stomachs. They poured hot whiskey down their throats. That brought them to. Of course. It always does. They all lived. But the feud was done for. That was the end of it. Hannah had put it to the bad. End of Section 7. Recording by Trisha G.